Welcome to Philly Prime. I'm Dave Schratweiser. This week on the show, we're going to talk about the art of serving a search warrant in light of the search warrant that was executed down at Mar-a-Lago in South Florida, former President Donald Trump's house on Monday, at his estate, I should say. And it's got nothing but major coverage all week long. It's a pretty heavy topic, and some breaking news here on Friday afternoon about that. We'll get to that in a moment. But joining me is South Jersey defense attorney, 21 years at the bar, James Leonard, Villanova Law School graduate, got a lot of local roots. Jim, welcome to the show again.
Dave, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
Okay, so listen, let's get right at it. Monday night, out breaks the news that the FBI 30-plus agents showed up at Mar-a-Lago in West Palm Beach and raided former President Donald Trump's estate there. Let's call it a raid because that's what it's normally called when the FBI shows up unannounced with guns and a search warrant. We can argue that all day long, but I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen it done many times. So have you. It's referred to as a raid in general by the media. So, Jim, just your thoughts when you heard this Monday night.
My first reaction was I was absolutely stunned, and I couldn't believe what I was reading on the news alert from CNN or Fox or wherever I learned it. It just seemed unprecedented that the executing a search warrant on a former sitting United States president. I know we all say, excuse me, in conversation that we are living in bizarre times, but just the initial learning that without knowing anything about it, seeing that headline, I was shocked, to say the least.
Okay. Breaking this afternoon, little bit of news. The Justice Department on Thursday asked the judge in this case, Magistrate Bruce Reinhart in South Florida, who's controversial himself in this situation, to unseal the sealed search warrant and the inventory, or the return, as the feds like to call it, as to what they confiscated during the execution of the search warrant. Although that hasn't officially happened, there is some leaks going on right now. The Wall Street Journal reporting that 11 sets of documents marked classified, were in there, including some marked top secret, 3-page memo supposedly involving the president of France, some other items that they describe in there, a 7-page search warrant, plus the probable cause, which is what we're talking about being released by the magistrate this afternoon. Your thoughts on that, given that the National Archives has been asking the president and has actually met with the president and his people as recently as June to go over these documents?
So if there is an ongoing dialogue between the National Archives and the president, or the president's attorneys or what have you, to stage a raid, and that's exactly what this was. This was a show of force. It was theatrics, and I'm not talking politics here. We're talking a United States citizen who happens to be a former president, whose home is raided by, military style raid with machine guns, etc. If that's happening while there is dialogue regarding these documents, and my understanding is that the National Archives was aware that he had them or suspected that he had them. So the question then becomes, what conversations were happening between these parties regarding the return of the documents, or him indicating that he didn't have to return them, but they were being safely kept. But the real former president. And I think anything short of that, anything short of a criminal charge of an indictment against former President Trump, this is going to be viewed historically as a major epic fail by the FBI and the Department of Justice in the way this was executed.
Okay, you're a defense attorney. You've been in this situation before where federal authorities, state authorities, county authorities want information from one of your clients. You're a defense attorney. They can either use a search warrant to go get it. They can ask you to surrender the documents on your client's behalf. They can give you a subpoena. They can get a court order. If you were in the middle of this, and it's hypothetical, if you were in the middle of this and there was this ongoing dialogue between the National Archives, the FBI in the middle, because the National Archives asked them to step in, and Mr. Trump's lawyers, and you had been there as recently as June and gone through 11 or 12 boxes of documents, seen what was in there, then called the president's people and asked them to padlock the storage room where they were and asked the Secret Service to do that. And the Secret Service, in fact, did do that, according to most reports we've heard. What would your next procedure have been if there was a disagreement about that? You would have expected either a court order or a subpoena, not a search warrant, I'm assuming.
100%. I would expect some sort of judicial intervention, some guidance from a authority regarding what we're going to do about these documents. What I would not be expecting for my client, and what I would not be expecting in a million years for my client, if he or she happened to be a former United States president, would be the execution of a FBI search warrant with machine guns, 30 agents. Absolutely not. I would be absolutely livid as an attorney that was participating in that process. That's why I think this is such a shock and awe situation where you're watching this, you can't believe you're watching it, and now we're hearing that, well, we were looking for some documents regarding nuclear weapons. Well, I didn't read anything about nuclear weapons in those 11 items that leaked. That remains to be seen, but the measuring stick by which this will be judged will be whether or not there are criminal charges and whether or not they are successful in prosecuting those charges. If they are not, I think they are empowering former President Trump regarding what is likely his ambitions to run again in 2024 and return to the White House.
Interesting. Last night, Donald Trump's lawyer, who was actually present, female attorney, very articulate on television last night, who was at the scene, arrived at the scene about an hour after the FBI did, and was left out in 95-degree temperatures outside, not allowed in the building, shown the search warrant briefly, and then given the search warrant and an inventory, which was very general at the time because they had not reviewed the documents. Basically said, we took a box here, we took a box there, stuff like that. You've been present for the execution of some search warrants. If you were there, don't you think you should have been able to at least accompany them or watch what they were doing? And even if they didn't like it, there was closed circuit TV. They refused, the Secret Service, to disable the cameras inside. So they do have, Trump's lawyers do have video of those guys searching the place. But as an attorney, if you were there, what would you have wanted?
One of a time that I remember being present during the execution of a search warrant, a federal search warrant. It was in a white collar case here in New Jersey. We knew that the FBI was coming. We had arranged a time. They came. If I remember correctly, there was maybe 3 or 4 agents. They knocked on the door. My client was a gracious host, had sat out coffee and muffins and Danish, and participated in helping them locate exactly what they were looking for. The search was very pointed.
Mm-hmm. As was this one, by the way.
What's that?
As was this one.
Right. So what happened there was myself and my client assisted them. He directed them to exactly what they were looking for and turned it over without incident, without any fanfare. Pleasantries were exchanged. There was no hostilities. And the entire event lasted probably less than 30 minutes. And I was present for all of it. Nobody kept me out of any rooms. We had a free conversation. They were simply there to retrieve information, and they got it, and the case moved forward. This is something drastically different. This is, you would expect to hear about this type of force if they were looking for El Chapo. This is what they would do if they were hitting El Chapo's safe house, not a primary residence of our former United States president. We're just living in some times where our institutions are being destroyed. And now we are, and take politics out of it, whether you like President Trump, don't like President Trump, it's immaterial. The reality of it is, this is what the Department of Justice saw fit to do to a former sitting president. What does that mean for you and I?
That's the question everybody's asking.
It's terrifying.
Interesting. You talk about execution of search warrants, and I'll give you some local examples where I've either been present or a camera crew that was working with me at Fox 29 at the time was present of search warrants executed by the FBI in recent years. Philip Narducci, an alleged organized crime figure, his South Jersey home was raided by the FBI. Police from the local township were stationed out in the street while they did that. He was brought out of the house and placed in an air-conditioned car while the FBI went through his house. I would point out they wore FBI raid jackets and or FBI shirts with their logo on it. There was probably upwards of 20 or 25. They spent hours at his residence. Dominic Randy, another alleged mob capo, his home was searched by the feds last year. Anthony Nicodemo, who's also a capo in the organized crime in South Philly, his father's house is raided in South Philly by the feds and the state police, probably more than 50 total between the two agencies. John Doherty, the head of Local 94, everybody remembers when his house was raided about 4 years ago. He stood out on the sidewalk in front of his South Philly home, drove up from the shore when he heard they were raiding his house and Local 94, and they were there all day long. He was talking to them. His attorneys were on the phone with them. At Local 94, they pulled up a U-Haul truck, just like they did at Mar-a-Lago, and hauled away boxes and boxes and boxes of evidence. Interesting, in this raid, if you believe the reports, FBI agents were not wearing raid jackets, possibly because it's Florida. They were not wearing FBI shirts. They were kind of non-discriminate. A few lawyers apparently were there, or U.S. attorneys, or agents in suits and ties, that kind of thing. So it's interesting, but the same kind of situation here in terms of what happens at an FBI raid. That's a standard FBI raid when it involves a potential criminal charge.
I think that if this turns out to be something that does not result in an indictment, this will be as epic of a failure as your friend Geraldo Rivera's Al Capone's vault, right? I mean, remember that spectacle on television?
I do.
And here, you are raiding the president's home. You're breaking into a safe. This is going to be very, very interesting to watch. And it's going to be interesting to learn more of the background about what those conversations were and whether or not these declassified items, if he lawfully possessed them. If he did, what type of cause of action does he potentially have against the Department of Justice? I mean, this is going to be very, very interesting to watch unfold.
And it's interesting, Jim, this happened Monday night. There were clarion calls to release the probable cause affidavit that goes with every search warrant. That's what a judge looks at before he decides whether to sign a search warrant or grant them the ability to execute the search warrant. There was no comment from the FBI. Even the new standard statement from the FBI, which goes like this, it's been used many times in the past 2 years, court authorized law enforcement activity at that location. That's what they will do if there's a public execution of a search warrant where people with their own eyes can see what's going on there. The FBI will, instead of no comment, or we can't comment, or we don't comment on ongoing investigations, their standard line these days is court authorized law enforcement activity at that location. That was not said. Nothing was said for 2 days. Yesterday, U.S. Attorney Merrick Garland said the public had a clear and powerful interest in knowing why they went there and executed a search warrant. I got to believe he made that statement because of the intense heat on him and FBI Director Wray about pulling this off and not saying why when it's a former president of the United States and potentially a presidential candidate against Joe Biden.
So for all of those reasons, and to take it even further, when the federal government is asking to execute a search warrant, and they're asking internally the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, et cetera, to authorize this search warrant, and then they put together an application and they are going to put it before a federal judge or magistrate, all of the eyes that are going to be on this to say, this is an idea that we have. This isn't one person that had an idea and another person executed it. There are going to be fingerprints all over this. FBI, U.S. Attorney, DOJ, the Attorney General himself, all the way up the ladder, the federal judge, and the fact that nobody called a timeout during this and said, wait a second, is there another way? Because the optics of this are going to look horrible. Now, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now if they found, nuclear weapon information or something that would be deemed espionage. If we're talking about Trump, and I read one of the things where he was alleged to have had, the clemency petition for Roger Stone.
Yes, I saw that as well.
These may ultimately be documents that he's allowed to have. So at the end of the day, what were we looking for? And we will find that out in the affidavit of probable cause. And did we find it? Because if we were looking for it and we didn't find it, there's a problem.
Okay.
There's a big problem. And let's see what happens.
Trump's lawyers have made the argument all week that according to the law about archival documents like this, the president is the only one who can classify a document, declassify a document, decide to dispose of the document, shred it, flush it down a toilet, as there was alleged sometime in the past week, those kinds of things. He's the only one who can do that. His lawyers today are saying that anything that was in those boxes had already been declassified by him before he left the White House. Let's make it clear. Mr. Trump has said, his lawyers have said, he didn't pack those boxes. The GSA packs the boxes. We saw a video the other day of them loading the boxes onto Marine One when he left the White House on Inauguration Day. So this is not something Donald Trump personally did. I'm not defending anybody here or anything like that. These are packed by employees at the White House or of the Government Services Administration. And on top of it, the National Archives has done this before, where presidents and or their spouses have left the White House with materials. Hillary Clinton allegedly left the White House with $30,000 worth of pictures, antiques, things like that. The National Archives asked for it back. Barack Obama left the White House, according to multiple published reports, with 30 million pages of documents. 30 million pages of documents, which he wanted to put in his library when it's built. So far, none of those have been kind of digitized as he promised 6.5 years later. So people do this. The National Archives does argue to get the documents back, as they are entitled to do. That's what they're there for. And in this case, they were in the process, it sounds like they were in the process of doing just that, getting them back. And I agree with you. And clearly there was another way to go here. And the other question I have, and this is where I'm going to go with this, Jim, should it have been a magistrate who made this decision, or a sitting federal judge or appellate court judge who made the decision to okay a search warrant at this level, the former president of the United States?
100%. I mean, that goes without say. And the question is, what was presented to them to make that decision? And where did that information come from? So what was articulated in that probable cause affidavit? How detailed was it? How reliable was it? And again, are we doing this because we wanted to retrieve these documents, or are we doing this because we're investigating whether or not there's any criminal wrongdoing. So if we're simply looking for these documents, we want them back, he's not giving them back, you go to the court sets the terms and the parameters of that. In an affidavit of probable cause, when you're asking the court for permission to execute a search warrant, you are following down the path of there's criminal activity and we believe.
All right, we lost you there for a second there, Jim. Talk about that, whether it should have been done by a magistrate or a federal court judge or even higher.
So I think in a circumstance like this, given the sensitive nature of who we're talking about, and the significance to have that request heard, that should have been done by a sitting federal judge or someone on the Court of Appeals, someone at the absolute highest level of the federal judiciary. With all due respect to this magistrate, not a magistrate. Right. It should have been done at a very significantly higher level. I just think this is going to be something that we will talk about for years and years to come. And it's going to be very interesting to see what becomes of this. I'm going to predict, I don't know that I'm going to be right, but I'm going to predict that there will not be criminal charges that will come from this. I think that what you're going to have is a news event, a lot of commentary about it. I think it will empower Trump going into 2024. Doesn't mean that I think he will win again, but it will certainly give him a boost. But I do not believe that this is going to result in a criminal charge, because if they were to charge him criminally, to convict him, to find a jury that would, 12 citizens that would convict the former president, I think is almost impossible. So they would further empower him. So they've backed themselves into a very, very unique corner. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they get out of it.
Magistrate Reinhardt, in fact, here, you made an interesting point before about calling a timeout and saying, hey, isn't there something else we could do since you're talking about these documents? You've all seen the documents. The president himself was there in June, came down and said hello to them, very cordial to them, and go do your work. And then told his lawyers and the people there for him, whatever they need, make sure they get it, kind of deal. That's their version of the story. We'll take that for that. Where was the call for a timeout? Hey, this doesn't check all the boxes, because it clearly doesn't check all the boxes. If it did, no one would be talking about it incessantly for the past 5 days. And you kind of wonder why he didn't just call a timeout. Now, there was also revelation last night that Garland, the United States attorney, approved this on Friday. If there was an urgency to say that Trump was potentially going to destroy the documents or take the documents from Mar-a-Lago to New Jersey, to Bedminster, where he's been staying, or to Trump Tower in New York. He wasn't there when this happened. If there was an urgency to get this done and do it right away, why would you sign it on Friday and not go to a judge and do it until Monday? That whole thing steals the urgency from what, at least at the beginning, kind of made it look like, oh, we had to go get these documents right now. Because that's what that looks like when 30 agents show up at your house and do a raid like this. It looks like there's an urgency to do this right now.
And it looks like the goal was not to actually get the documents back. It looks like the goal was to stage this theatrical raid, as you've called it, that was what they were more interested than retrieving the documents in a more respectful fashion, given the fact that this is a former president we're talking about. And again, whether people like or dislike the president, this is just not the way you go about business, particularly in a law enforcement setting when there's lawyers involved and they're having conversations I believe this was extremely unnecessary.
All right. I know Jim Leonard is fast on his feet. So I'm going to ask you, now that we see, at least generally, what it is they got in the inventory list, what they took from former President Trump's estate down at Mar-a-Lago. Now that you know what they took, now that you know that their stance is that he declassified these documents before he left the White House. By the way, he doesn't have to tell anybody he did that. He doesn't have to send a note to anybody and say, excuse me, I didn't do my homework here. He doesn't have to do anything like that. If he declassified the documents, even if he didn't do it to the letter of the law, which I've never seen executed like this or gone after like this, the law that governs these documents leaving the White House or what the president can and cannot take with him. If you were the lawyer right now and you had to go into court, say Monday, today's Friday, what argument would you make that this ought to just be thrown out to a judge?
Well, the interesting part
stop the grand jury, stop this probe. This is ridiculous at this point. This is, I think the president called this un-American, former President Trump, un-American, unwarranted, and unnecessary.
So my question is, and I haven't seen this, so pardon me if I misspeak here, but have they convened any sort of grand jury regarding these documents or this investigation, or are they simply attempting to do that based on what they find?
I believe they haven't said anything about a grand jury because you're not allowed to talk about grand juries or what goes on in a grand jury. But there have been news reports that there was a grand jury opened into this right after they realized the documents were in fact at Mar-a-Lago, and they have been proceeding with a grand jury. Supposedly, again, they're supposed to be secret, so we don't know all the details, and they haven't confirmed any of that. But this situation, if there is a grand jury, or even if there isn't, or they're going to go to a grand jury with this, would you do something to stop that, to blunt that, to go to a judge and say, Your Honor, this is absurd. This has never been done before. Raiding the home of a former president. There are other examples of people leaving the White House, former presidents and or their spouses, with materials like this, and never before have we gone to their homes, presidential libraries, or anywhere else to retrieve these documents. How would you go to bat for your client in this case?
So if I was representing a regular client, perhaps I would, file a motion even after the search warrant was issued to try to quash it or do something like that. The difference here is President Trump is going to do all of that, not in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
He is going to be, I believe, very soon, very loud and very aggressive on his soapbox regarding this. And I think that's all going to culminate in that he's running again for president. He's already putting some videos and some materials and some teasers out there. But I believe that what they've done here is they've given him a perfect catalyst to launch into, it's necessary. Because this is what they're doing. If they did this to me,
Mm-hmm.
they can do it to you.
Mm-hmm.
And listen. And again, I don't do politics. I'm not one of those individuals. But we see a raid on the former president's home and safe, looking for these documents. I read about the Hunter Biden laptop. I read about deals with China. I don't see any big rush to indict the son of the president, right? I see that. I read about that in the newspapers and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I just think that this is another thing that compromises these institutions that we hold so near and dear, like the criminal justice system, like the media, all of this. And now we're getting to the White House. It's just absolute. Imagine what some of these countries are thinking when they look at us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you go back and you think of President Reagan and you think of the way we were looked at in the world, and I think that followed with Bush, Clinton, Obama. I think now with the last two and the way, and that's because of the media, and that's because of a lot of other internal and external factors, Dave, they have to be laughing at us. Like this, you're not raiding Jimmy Carter's home. That's not happening. Never going to happen.
No, you're not raiding Barack Obama's home. You're not raiding George Bush's home. You would have never raided Ronald Reagan's home out in California. You just wouldn't have done it. There was one element of this search, Jim, we didn't get to. The safe. You just mentioned it. Allegedly, according to reports, the FBI brought along a technician who was able to open the president's safe in his office. The president's lawyer was outside at the time, communicating with the president, the former president, in New York, back and forth. Before you did that, had your technician open the former president's safe in his private office at Mar-a-Lago, wouldn't you have just said to the attorney, before we do this, if the president wants to give us the combination right here through you, and we will acknowledge that you gave it to us, and then open the safe, and according to Mr. Trump, nothing was in the safe. And if it turns out nothing was in the safe, that's really going to look, in addition to everything else, kind of like a really buffoon-like thing.
Well, first of all, I think that if I was the FBI agent or if I was supervising this search, what we would have done is we would have seized the safe. We wouldn't have opened it. We wouldn't have made a spectacle that we busted in, right? Like we were going to find something of, significance there. We would have seized it, just like you would seize these hard drives, et cetera, these documents that you're looking for. And it would have been entered into in a different environment, perhaps with, can you give us the code? Can you give it to your lawyer so we can go in? We want to return it back to you in good form. This is theatrics. This is all theatrics. And I'm not saying that for political reasons. No. I'm saying that because all of this appears to be unnecessary.
Yeah. And that's been what you've said from the start of this podcast. And others have said in addition. So it's just kind of a situation where you kind of wonder how well thought out this was down the line. And you heard the U.S. Attorney, Merrick Garland, say yesterday in his brief press conference where he took no questions from reporters that he personally okayed this. He personally okayed it. That's at the highest level. I would assume FBI Director Wray either knew about it, heard about it, or also gave the nod to go ahead and do it. At this level, you would think that would happen. That's why the magistrate approving this really stinks. If we went to the highest level of the Justice Department, the U.S. Attorney General himself, the head of the FBI to get approval for this, why would you not go to a high-ranking, top-ranking judge to say, hey, I want to make sure you guys checked all the boxes before you take an unprecedented, history-breaking thing like executing a search warrant at Donald Trump's. And it doesn't matter what the president's name is here. Any former sitting president. To do this to them, to me, had to be
100%.
Dot all the I's, cross all the T's here, check all the boxes before I let you do that. And judges do sometimes deny permission to go get a search warrant or to go get these items until he has enough proof. Happens all the time.
100%. And I think that I'm going to borrow your word. I think this entire thing is buffoonish. I really do. I think this entire thing is buffoonish from top to bottom. I cannot even believe that this is what we're talking about, that this happened. And, but we get surprised, unfortunately these days, very frequently where we see things and we can't believe that it's happening, right? So in a circumstance like this, I'm going to watch this, but I think they have given Trump absolute rocket fuel with respect to his announcement. Now, whether he will be successful remains to be seen. He's got a long road ahead of him. He's a very polarizing individual. Some people love him. Some people absolutely detest him. I don't know if this will somehow make him more, likable or humanize him more to those that feel polarized by him. But at the end of the day, Dave, when I saw that alert to take it back to the top of the show, I had to take a double take because I couldn't believe what I was reading.
Yeah.
It was almost seemed to, if you came to me and said, I have the idea for a novel, it's going to start out with the FBI raiding the former president's home, I would wave you off and say, what are we doing, like science fiction here? Because that sounds too far-fetched to believe. Nobody's going to buy it.
Yeah.
And here we are talking about it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Some of Trump's folks yesterday were saying on different networks that the fundraising for a potential Trump run in 2024 jumped this week from people so disgusted with kind of what went on here. And I think this goes to a level of fairness, Jim. I think the American people are not stupid. I think they're very intelligent. I think they can read the tea leaves here. They can see the writing on the wall, use whatever cliche you want to use here. When they see something that is inherently unfair in their judgment, if in fact that is what they think, and there's polls already that have come out about what people think about what happened here. If this turns out to be unfair, I do believe this is going to drive people to say, I don't want to elect somebody who's going to allow something like this to go on. And again, the White House has said they were not made aware of this. They didn't know what was happening. No one gave them, cued them into it. No, the president didn't give a head nod to it. The vice president, anybody else. This was strictly a Department of Justice, a DOJ thing. But if this turns out to be a fruitless execution of a search warrant, raid, call it whatever you want to call it at this point, if that's what it turns out to be, this is a huge backfire at many levels.
I agree with you, and respectfully, I don't believe that the White House was unaware of this. There is absolutely no scenario that there is a dialogue about getting this search warrant, and there is not somebody connected to the president who gets this whispered to him or her, and it's then whispered up the ladder. So I reject that. Do I think that they were involved in, planning it, or no? But they are absolutely being told that it's in motion. 100%. 100%. I mean, look at what we've learned. I'm back. So look at what we've learned when you see, like, for example, the raid on the Pakistani compound where we found bin Laden. Look at all of the people, all of the layers that were involved in that, the decision making, and then the execution of that. I find it hard to believe that people are going to be in the dark when it comes to executing a search warrant at the home of a former United States president. I just have to reject that as absolute nonsense.
Yeah, you could also see it as a potential courtesy to the president to just have somebody whisper in his ear that you might get asked about this, getting on Marine One or getting on Air Force One because he was leaving to go on vacation this week. You might get asked about this just so you know right now what's going on at Mar-a-Lago. We just executed a search warrant there on former President Trump. You could see a little bit of a heads up after it was underway kind of thing, just in case he got asked about it and he could no comment it. We'd appreciate it if you no commented that and directed everybody back to us, which is what the White House did that night. That's what they said. We don't have any comment on it. We don't know about it. We didn't know about it. Talk to the DOJ kind of thing. That's the way you would normally handle that. I know that because I was in government, in a public official status as a former deputy press secretary and communications director in New Jersey. And routinely, after something was already underway, if the governor or a top official was making public appearances that day, we would let them know after it was underway that we were doing something, again, authorized, court authorized law enforcement activity at a certain location. That general. You would almost have to do that.
Yes, it's not even feasible to think. And the irony here is, I agree with that. And if somebody does whisper that to him, his immediate response should have been, let me stop what I'm doing. Get me on the phone with the attorney general now. And clearly, I don't believe any of that happened because this should have been stopped. Somebody should have intervened here and said, no, absolutely no. And it didn't. And it didn't. And I do think, I agree with you. I think this is going to backfire. I think it's going to further empower Trump. And I think it's an embarrassment to the United States government and to us as citizens in the eyes of the global, the world. I think they're laughing at us right now.
Okay, Jim, let's wrap this up. You and I both have tremendous respect for the FBI. I know that you know many FBI agents in South Jersey and Philadelphia, other jurisdictions, things like that. I know hundreds of FBI agents. I can actually say that I'm friends with some FBI agents out of the office, so to speak, who lived in my neighborhoods that I've lived in over the years, who I've had interactions with. We are not talking about the street level FBI agents, the mid-level FBI agents. These decisions were made by the highest levels of the Department of Justice and the FBI. No one is disparaging FBI agents who bust their ass every day
absolutely not,
to enforce federal laws involving guns, drugs, organized crime, terrorism, things like that. We're not talking about that. We're not trying to disparage the FBI. We're talking about a single search warrant of a former U.S. president at his home. That's all we're talking about. And I think when you look at that, it's the higher-ups that you're talking about and how that decision got made and why they went to a low-level magistrate in South Florida, not in Washington, D.C., to make this decision. And to me, I just want to be clear here, no one on this podcast is disrespecting the FBI at the level that we're talking about here, the guys who do the men and women who do all the boots on the ground work.
Listen, the FBI is the creme de la creme of law enforcement in this country. That is universally known by anyone and everyone who works in law enforcement, casual observers. So you are looking at the FBI and you are holding them in the absolute highest regard, as they should be, period. And I agree with that 1,000%. This decision, wherever it was made and whatever motivated it, that's what makes it even more of a head scratcher, because the FBI is not the agency that makes these types of decisions, these bad decisions. The FBI's judgment, the FBI's execution very rarely comes into question unless you are put into an adversarial position with them, in a criminal matter, let's say, and you represent a client and you take issue with what the FBI's done or whatnot. But as far as strategy and execution, the FBI is as good as it gets, not only locally, nationally. And that's what makes this decision all the more troubling, is that all those checks and balances, something happened here, something got off track, and I believe a very bad decision was made, and I believe it was even executed even worse. And I'd be curious to see what some of those individuals that you and I both have relationships with think about this privately, whether they agree or disagree. But I think this is something that history will look back on, and this will not be their finest moment, but they have many fine moments, and this is not among them.
Yeah, I think over a beer or a martini, you might hear different things from agents, former and present, from the FBI. Jim, listen, I greatly appreciate a very lively, interesting, intelligent, and let's say historic podcast for us, talking about something that's never happened before in this country, the raid, the execution of a search warrant on a former president's home, former President Donald Trump. I doubt very much we're ever going to have this kind of a podcast again, talking about this subject, especially if this turns out to be as bad as we think it might be, and it turns out to be not a fair carrying out of justice by the Department of Justice. If it turns out that way, we might never ever have this conversation again. We might be talking about it for a long time, but not about this kind of topic. And again, appreciate you coming on the show, Jim. Always a pleasure having you on.
Dave, the pleasure is mine. And I think that maybe 6 months from now or so, we should drop back in on this and see what has happened.
Yeah.
It's going to be very interesting. But thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right, well, recheck the landscape. Might be a good idea either 6 months or a month or 2 months from now. Let's see what happens. I appreciate it, Jim. Thanks for coming on. And folks, thanks for listening to Philly Prime this week. Incredibly interesting conversation. I really enjoyed this. And again, thanks to Jim Leonard, a good friend of mine and a very good attorney. And I appreciate his time. Folks, thanks for joining us. Join us again next week.